This learning objective asks us to understand how firms use the long-run average cost curve in their planning.
Now let's look at a firm's long-run costs. Remember, in the long run, all costs are variable. In our example for Jill making pizzas, we saw some of her inputs, ovens in particular, were fixed. Well, that's no longer the case since we're looking at the long run. So here in figure 11.6, let's illustrate the relationship between the short-run average costs and long-run average costs. In this case, though, let's change the industry to the automobile industry. Recall, long-run average cost curves show the lowest cost among all short-run options at which a firm is able to produce a given quantity, but in the long run. So let's begin with a relatively small car factory. Its average total cost curve is illustrated here. Notice, at a quantity of 20,000 cars, the average total cost is $52,000, the lowest possible average cost given all options. Now let's say that firm grows, or we introduce a larger company, say Ford for example, and we see they will be able to sell 200,000 cars, and thus its average total cost at that quantity will fall to $27,000. Notice once again, if we introduce yet another automaker to increase the number of cars produced, say to 400,000 cars, notice the average total cost has not changed from before. It's still $27,000. Well, this sort of situation where we see an increase in quantity but average total cost stays the same is known as a constant returns to scale. As we continue on, however, at say very large automobile makers, they experience what is known as diseconomies of scale. Notice the average costs are rising as output rises in the long run. Specifically, at 500,000 cars, we see the average total cost increase from $27,000 to $32,000. By connecting all the lowest short-run average costs, we construct the long-run average cost curve. Now let's look at three parts of this long-run average cost curve. First, there's an area described as economies of scale. Notice, from 0 cars produced up to 200,000 cars produced, average costs in the long run are falling. Second, we see at the very beginning, or at exactly 200,000 cars produced, we describe this as minimum efficient scale. That's when economies of scale ends. At this minimum point, up through 400,000 cars, or simply from 200,000 to 400,000 cars produced, we have the average costs in the long run remaining constant. Once again, this is known as constant returns to scale. And finally, if an automobile manufacturer produces over 400,000 cars, notice average costs are rising in the long run, and this is described as diseconomies of scale. But now we see the link between the short-run average costs and the long-run average costs.
So why might a firm such as a car company experience economies of scale? Well, first, the firm's technology may make it possible to increase output at a greater than proportional rate as inputs increase. Second, specialization among workers and managers may lead them to become more productive as output increases. And third, large firms such as Ford, Amazon, and Apple may be able to purchase their inputs at lower costs when compared to their smaller competitors. But economies of scale will not last forever as output increases. Eventually, very large firms experience diseconomies of scale because managers begin to have difficulty coordinating all aspects of their operations. Now let's hear Professor Hubbard explain diseconomies of scale at the Ford Motor Company.
Can a firm be too large? Here's the point. Firms sometimes fail to recognize that diseconomies of scale can raise their costs. The car industry is an iconic manufacturing industry with a rich history of change. Henry Ford used interchangeable parts in a moving assembly line to attain economies of scale at his large factory in Highland Park outside Detroit. Ford believed that he could produce automobiles at an even lower average cost by building a still larger plant along the River Rouge in Dearborn, Michigan. Unfortunately, Ford's managers had great difficulty coordinating the production of automobiles in such a large plant. and it suffered from diseconomies of scale. Because of the high average cost of production at the River Rouge plant, Ford actually lost money manufacturing the Model A there. The lesson of diseconomies came home. Ford eventually reduced the cost of making the Model A by constructing smaller factories that could produce the Model A at a lower average cost than was possible at the River Rouge plant.
Here in Table 11.4 is a very useful summary of all of the costs we defined and measured in this chapter. It will be very helpful to refer back to this table since we will use these terms in later chapters, especially marginal cost, average total cost, and average variable cost. Finally, be sure not to make the following mistakes. Technology refers to the process of turning inputs into outputs. Increasing average cost can occur both in the short run due to diminishing returns or in the long run because of diseconomies of scale. However, these are two different explanations. When calculating marginal values such as marginal cost or marginal product, don't forget the variable in the denominator. Finally, there is no specific time period that classifies as the long run. Instead, it refers to a time period long enough for all inputs to change.